Coming up next, I would love to introduce y'all to Jen Coster, who is a Chinese American doctor turned professional storyteller. She is the associate editor for podcast magazine Escape Pod and a narrative designer for game studio Butterscotch Shenanigans. Without further ado, let's give Jen a warm welcome.
Hey everyone. Today I'm going to talk about how the concept of the hero's journey colonized our ideas of what makes a worthwhile story, and how we, as game designers, can challenge dominant narratives to build better, truer worlds. Before we get into it, let's take a moment to define a couple of terms. I'm going to be using the terms narrative lens and narrative structure throughout this talk. These concepts are closely related, but they are two distinct things. When I talk about a narrative lens, I'm talking about the lens through which you interpret or create a narrative or a story. This is often something that is implicit and somewhat invisible. Left uninterrogated, it can be made up of various biases and assumptions that we've internalized about the world. Therefore, it's possible for both the adoption and application of a narrative lens to be unintentional. A narrative lens functions like guideposts or design pillars. It helps you decide what things are valuable and significant, and equally importantly, what things are not. A narrative structure is the shape of the plot, the how and the when of the events that unfold. It's an organizational tool that's usually explicit that you choose to apply to the story you're telling. It's the 3-act, 7-point circle pyramid that gets you from a story's beginning to its end. Put another way, a narrative structure might guide you on how many cutscenes there are and what tonal direction they're headed in, i.e., rising or falling tension. But a narrative lens guides your decisions about what to show in those cutscenes. It's an important distinction. How we view the shape of the world influences how we act upon it. As game designers, I think this is something that we understand better than most. We choose the set of actions that a player can take, and we choose the context in which those actions take place. Swinging an axe means something different when you're swinging it at a tree versus at a person. It means something else if you're doing so in offense or in defense. We give players choices, but those choices are constrained by choices we have already made, by the shape of the world we have constructed around them. Now that that's established, let's talk about the hero's journey. If you're involved at all in the creation or consumption of stories, and if you're watching this, you definitely are, particularly here in the United States, you are familiar with the hero's journey. The hero's journey, also known as the monomyth, is a narrative pattern described by Joseph Campbell, a lit professor who did work in comparative mythology, most famously with his 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces. In his work, he asserted that the hero's journey is universal, that is, a narrative lens and structure that can be found in and applied to myths and stories from cultures all around the world. Its near ubiquitous spread into popular consciousness can likely be traced back to the original Star Wars. During an interview, George Lucas name dropped Campbell, and the rest is, as they say, history. I'm oversimplifying that story by a lot, but that's what Campbell did too. I'm not going to go into each of the 17 structural parts of Campbell's hero's journey in detail. So many people have devoted so many words to that already. When we see, are taught, and then apply this structure, it's usually simplified, perhaps most famously, at least in writer circles, by Christopher Vogler in his book, The Writer's Journey. I'm going to give you a broad stroke summary of the narrative structure, and I'm betting it's going to sound familiar, particularly if you think about the story beats of the vast majority of AAA games. A hero living in the ordinary world reluctantly answers the call to adventure, which is a euphemistic way of saying that something disrupts his life, and that something is usually violence, and that violence is usually done to those around him. This forces him to enter an unfamiliar world where he faces a bunch of obstacles, gains in power, which, depending on genre, can be physical, social, hierarchical, supernatural, or some combination thereof, and then ultimately confronts, again, usually violently, the force that precipitated his journey. achieving victory by any means necessary, which results in his making a choice about returning, either literally or metaphorically, to the world he knew before, now changed from who he was when the journey began. You may have noticed that I've been using he to refer to Campbell's hero. Put a pin in that, and we'll come back to it in a second. So now let's talk about Campbell's narrative lens. Remember, this is what the narrative structure is built upon or within. These are the assumptions, whether purposeful or not, that the hero's journey makes. And because these assumptions are underlying, they influence the messaging of the stories crafted within this lens. And it's possible to apply this lens without knowing that you're doing so, especially along the axes where you align with established social power structures. The narrative lens of Campbell's hero's journey then tells us this. Heroes are lone individuals, separate from both community and context. Others are present to be helpers, rewards, or obstacles for the hero, objects rather than people. Attachments are a weakness, and therefore asking for, wanting, or needing help is a weakness. Heroes are good, and therefore absolved. And fulfillment is achieved through personal victory, and victory is found in gaining the upper hand. As Sarah E. Bond and Joel Christensen write in their LA Review of Books article, the use of the monomyth is in a way nearly perfectly narcissistic. It invites audiences to focus on just one character, to see the world as serving the interests of one singular point of view. Another person's choices, their pain, even their death is actually about someone else, the hero, and how he is affected, how his choices are justified, how he is motivated to then achieve his goals. Like in Revenge of the Sith, Padme Amidala's death in a setting where both magic and sci-fi technology exists happens because of and for Anakin, to the exclusion of character and in-world consistency. Now, as I mentioned before, in describing Campbell's narrative model, I've been using male pronouns to describe our hero. That's deliberate because it's almost always a him, and that him is also usually white. Neither of these biases are required. You can, after all, apply the steps to any protagonist, but Campbell's views were ethnocentric, and he was rigid in his strict notions of binary gender and their respective roles in a story. To this day, the vast majority of protagonists we get are white, cis men, with a much smaller proportion being cis women who can only succeed if they deny the sociocultural markers of their gender. It's how we get the trope of the strong female character who's strong because she's not girly. Despite the sheer ubiquity of the hero's journey and the stories we see, Campbell's claim of universality is not the truth. The truth is that Campbell looked at the rich story traditions of other cultures through his own lens, one that is white, Western, cishet, and male. And he cherry-picked aspects that would support his theory while ignoring dissimilarities that undermined it. Campbell's notions of power, success, and adversity are very much rooted in his own sociological positioning, but he presented them as universal, and not just universal, but fundamental to the kinds of stories that people tell. Whether this was unconscious or intentional, the impact remains the same. The universalization of Campbell's narrative model, especially in the US, colonized the narrative landscape, filtering stories through his specific narrative lens. You can see it embedded in the stories that have been popularized and told to the last few generations, in the movies we watch, the books that we read, and of course, the games that we play. This narrative pattern is also at the root of what Meghna Jayanth calls white protagonism in her Digra India 2021 keynote. She says, under capitalism colonialism, we do not have to intentionally design for these outcomes, but they are almost inevitable unless we deliberately and intentionally design against them. When we use a narrative structure without explicitly examining its narrative lens, we can unwittingly reproduce the assumptions of that lens. When we mistake a specific narrative lens for an inevitable and a universal one, we limit the kinds of stories we can tell and whose stories get told. As an industry, video games emerged and evolved as the hero's journey established its dominance of the narrative landscape. And the interactive nature of video games makes it particularly challenging to reject this type of heroic lens and structure. Out of technological necessity, video games tend to center one perspective at a time, and that perspective needs to affirm the player as the locus of choice and agency, making it very easy to reinforce the concept of the individualist protagonist. And when the narrative lens is that of the hero's journey, then conflict, failure, power, and success each look a particular way. Conflict is defined by violence and a denial of agency. Failure is having vulnerability or needing help. Power is obtained through gaining personal skill or resources. And success is about overpowering, overcoming, or dominating what stands against you. The loops that drive player engagement then reproduce a particular type of power fantasy related to the accumulation of personal strength and influence, most often through violence, over that of static NPCs, whose sole purpose is to literally be of use to the player, providing them with the tools to win, whether it be in the form of quests, rewards, or someone to fight against. If everything is there to serve the player, then the player's experience and perspective is the only one that matters, and you don't need to spend additional resources creating anything beyond low-dimensional characters and worlds. Telling other kinds of stories requires a different kind of foundation. This was what I was thinking about when I joined Butterscotch Shenanigans as the narrative designer for Crashlands 2, the sequel to their 2016 game Crashlands. Crashlands is a slapsticky sci-fi crafting survival game about a package courier that crash lands on an alien planet and ends up saving the world. Flux is a human outsider to a strange, new to her planet, and she travels around accumulating resources, solving everyone's problems, and gaining in power and knowledge until she can finally face the big bad and defeat him in combat. After she changes the whole world, she gets to leave, and everyone else is left to deal with the aftermath. She's the lone hero with no contextual knowledge who is still somehow the best person to save the day. Crashlands is colorful, it's fun, it's lighthearted, and it very much unwittingly reproduces the hero's journey narrative pattern. That's not the kind of story I want Crashlands 2 to tell. But Crashlands 2 is constrained by the choices made in the first game. A sequel still needs to give you the vibes of the original. The story is still about an outsider, a strange new world, and ultimately saving the day. It's constrained to the same genre and general mechanics of the first, all of which are poised on the slippery trope slopes of the monomyth and colonialism. The solution is, as with many solutions, simple but not easy. Use a different lens, which requires both an explicit examination of the biases we've internalized and conscious, deliberate choices about the context of the player's actions, even if the narrative arc follows a similar structural pattern. For example, Elden Ring is very much about the player moving through a strange new world, building power until you can confront the forces underpinning that world so that you can reshape it to how you want. But at the same time, there are factions and forces at play much larger than the player, and how you fit into their schemes isn't entirely clear. The world isn't about you. Hades is another game whose story maps onto the structure of the hero's journey. As Zagreus, you attempt to escape the underworld, the only home you've ever known, to reach the surface and find your mother Persephone, aided or hindered by various Olympic and chthonic gods. But what makes each attempt memorable is the relationships you're building with the other characters and what you learn about their relationships with each other. Accepting help makes you stronger and is critical to your success. The way that we approached this in Crashlands 2 was by building the game on 4 main narrative pillars: fulfillment, found family, community action, and indigenous knowledge. During design discussions, we refer back to these core concepts when thinking about the game's mechanics and features. How we interpret and develop these themes, both explicitly in the form of the actual written story and implicitly in the form of what player actions are rewarded and when, changes the focus and message of Flux's narrative. For example, when we take the idea of personal fulfillment, defined as the feeling of satisfaction or happiness as a result of developing your character or abilities, and tie it strongly to community fulfillment, then skill advancement requires Flux to integrate with and help the communities around her. And it's through deepening her relationships with other characters that she gets better, faster, and stronger. An emphasis on community action, which is about mutual aid to solve giant problems, means that asking for and accepting help is a strength, and communal action is heroic. The best solutions come from building community power and gaining insight from others. Flux has the option to go it alone if she wants to, but that's not going to get you the best outcome. It might ultimately make things worse. This also means that NPCs bring things to the table. They have power, skill, ideas. They have knowledge and nuance that is not only valuable, but critical for understanding the world, its problems, and the possible solutions. Flux might bring a new outside perspective to them, but it's only one perspective, and it's not necessarily the best one. Because this is the narrative lens through which we're designing the game, then conflict, failure, power, and success are defined relative to that lens. The narrative arc and structure, the beats of the story, are then determined by those definitions. So in Crashlands 2, conflict is related to threats against the community. Failure is a result of acting alone without context or care. The accumulation of power is about building relationships, and success comes from working together towards a shared victory. If the hero's journey narrative arc is protagonist arrives, builds personal power, conquers what stands against them, achieving victory and gaining glory, then in contrast, we want the central story arc of Crashlands 2 to be protagonist arrives, helps to build a network of relationships, and then works together with friends towards a collective victory, which is a story that seems closer to the truth anyway. Flux's story is not about how her actions benefit herself, but about how her actions impact the people and world around her. This requires us to design in a way that allows that impact to be felt by the player. The world cannot exist solely to support and venerate one person at the expense of every other. NPCs have their own stories, and the player is not the center of them. The player is not the only person with agency. Further, it's also possible to abandon the structure of the hero's journey entirely for something else. And that is a whole entire other talk. But the indie space is rich with games that play with these other possibilities. From the coming of age self-discovery narrative of Sable to the time loop exploration sleuthing of the Outer Wilds, there are stories being told that the hero's journey doesn't account for. There have always been stories that the hero's journey doesn't account for. What makes these games so beautiful and resonant and interesting is that they reject the dominant narrative model for something else. When we don't closely examine the perspectives we've internalized and that can be embedded in the tools that we're using, we reinforce the ideas of the sociological default. Using the hero's journey narrative structure without considering its narrative lens and its intersection with a game's mechanics and design, as well as the realities of the broader social structures of the real world, ends up reinforcing dominant ideas of what is allowed to be considered valuable. It's our responsibility then to look at what kinds of stories, what kinds of journeys we have internalized as more important, more valuable, more worthy of telling than others. What qualities do we valorize, emulate, and idealize in our heroes? It comes down to explicit examination and deliberate choice. When we don't articulate the narrative lens we're using, we will fall back on the frameworks we have been given rather than the ones we choose for ourselves. The narrative of the hero's journey is failing us. The reification of this particular kind of story absolves a type of ends-justified, self-interested hyper-individualism that actively rejects community care. When we think of heroism, of protagonism, as being only a lone person facing off against a big bad, people who consider themselves heroes will experience community-oriented rules to be restrictive rather than compassionate. If everyone thinks they're a good guy with a gun, then we don't need gun control. But we need to remember that the hero's journey is not a truth of the world. It is a construct created at a particular time by a particular kind of person, and constructs can be dismantled. The prevailing sociocultural power structures want us to stand alone instead of within a community, because no one person acting alone can dismantle a system. Communities both need and provide support that dominant forces can't profit from. In the current state of the world, people who have previously always been served by those structures are coming to realize this. Those of us at the margins, who've always been failed by these established systems, have always known this. As game designers, we create worlds, and the worlds we create are shaped by the stories we contain within ourselves. We have been told for so long that heroes look like one thing, that there is only one kind of worthwhile story to tell. But there are more stories that aren't the hero's journey than stories that are. And we contain so much more that is worth sharing than the dominant structures account for. When the established frameworks don't allow for the stories we want to tell, the stories that we need to tell, we can discard them. We can rediscover, reinvent, and build new ones. We can create worlds that Joseph Campbell could never have imagined. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jen, for that super rad talk. Everyone else, if you haven't already, please make sure you give gdocExpo a follow on Twitter, Instagram, and or Facebook.